In the spring of 1987, at a farm equipment liquidation sale outside of Grundy Center, Iowa, a 31-year-old woman named Nora Reinhardt paid $40 for a cardboard box full of paper. The auctioneer almost didn't list it. He held it up with one hand, tilted it toward the crowd so they could see the stack of scale tickets and grain receipts and handwritten ledger pages inside, and said more or less that if anybody wanted it, $40 would take the whole thing, and if nobody did, he'd leave it on the tailgate and move on. Nora raised her hand. The man next to her, a corn and soybean farmer from over near Rhinebeck, looked at her the way you look at someone who has just done something you cannot explain. He did not say anything. He didn't need to. The expression was enough. The box weighed maybe 4 pounds. It smelled like a grain bin in August. The papers inside went back to 1971, 16 years of scale tickets from the Grundy County elevator, yield maps drawn by hand on graph paper, and a notebook filled with a dead man's observations about why the numbers never matched. The dead man was Harold Fenwick, who had farmed 480 acres of Grundy County ground for 32 years and had spent the last decade of his life trying to understand why his yield monitor told him one thing and the elevator told him another, and why the gap between those two numbers was costing him more money than he could account for through spoilage or shrinkage or any other explanation the co-op gave him. Harold was 68 when he died, and the gap was still there. Nobody at the sale wanted his notes. Nora Reinhardt paid $40 for them and drove home. The story spread the way all stories spread in Grundy County, from the liquidation sale to the feed store in Grundy Center, from the feed store to the elevator office, from the elevator office to the coffee counter at the diner on G Avenue, and from the diner to the church parking lot on Sunday morning, gaining weight at every stop. A woman had paid $40 for a dead man's paperwork, for a box of old scale tickets, for nothing. Her brother-in-law, Dale Reinhardt, heard about it at the co-op on a Tuesday and called her that evening to ask what she thought she was doing. Nora told him she'd bought some records she wanted to look at. Dale said that Harold Fenwick had been confused in his last years and that everybody knew it. Nora said she appreciated him calling. She hung up and went back to the kitchen table where the papers were spread out in 16 years of chronological order. Let me tell you about Nora Reinhardt, because what she did with that box of paper only makes sense if you understand who she was and where she came from and what she had been taught to believe about numbers. Nora was born in 1956 on a 320-acre farm in Grundy County, Iowa. The second of 4 children, and the only one who followed her father into the fields with any real attention. Her father was Walter Reinhardt, a man who had come back from Korea with a preference for silence and a deep suspicion of anything he couldn't verify himself. Walter had been a supply clerk in the Army, which meant he had spent 2 years tracking the difference between what the requisition form said and what actually arrived, and he had developed in that time a finely calibrated sense for the gap between reported figures and actual figures. He brought that sense home to Grundy County and applied it to farming. He kept a ledger, not a casual ledger, not a notebook with occasional entries, but a disciplined double-entry ledger that he updated every Friday evening without exception. Sitting at the kitchen table under the lamp with a cup of coffee and a mechanical pencil, recording every bushel sold, every input purchased, every fuel fill, every repair. He kept the scale tickets in a manila envelope clipped to the inside cover. He kept the elevator receipts in a second envelope. Every spring he reconciled them against each other and against his own field estimates. And every spring he noted the discrepancy in a column he had labeled simply in his precise block printing the word difference. Walter taught Nora to keep the ledger when she was 12 years old, not because she asked, because he decided she was ready. He sat her down one Friday evening and showed her the system from the beginning. The columns, the reconciliation method, the manila envelopes, the way you never trusted a single number from a single source, but always confirmed it against at least one other. He told her that a number you couldn't verify was an opinion, and that opinions were fine for conversation, but had no place in a farm record. Nora took over the ledger completely by the time she was 15. Walter checked her work for the first 2 years and then stopped checking because there was nothing to correct. Walter's workshop was behind the house, a poured concrete building 30 feet by 40 feet with a wood stove in the corner and a workbench along the south wall that he had built himself from oak planks in 1952. He had a lathe he'd bought, used from a machine shop in Marshalltown in 1961, a drill press, a welding rig, and enough hand tools to fill 3 pegboards. He maintained everything himself. He calibrated his grain moisture meter every fall against a reference sample he kept in a sealed jar. He checked his scale with certified weights every spring. He was not paranoid. He was precise. There is a difference, and Walter Reinhardt understood it clearly. He died in January of 1984 during Nora's 28th year of a heart attack in the machine shed. He left her the farm, paid for, 320 acres with no mortgage and no operating loan. A savings account with $34,000 in it, the workshop and everything in it, and the ledger going back to 1959. He left the ledger to her, specifically by name, in a handwritten note attached to the will. Her brothers received equipment and cash. Nora received the record of everything. She had been farming the place alongside Walter for 6 years by then, and she continued farming it alone after his death, without asking her brothers for help or her bank for money. She grew corn and soybeans on 280 acres and kept 40 acres in hay for the dozen beef cattle she ran on the back pasture. She bought inputs with cash at the beginning of each season and sold grain with cash at the end. She did not have a line of credit. She did not want one. She had watched the 1980s unfold around her, watched the interest rates climb to 18% and the land values collapse, and the farms that had borrowed heavily against inflated ground go to auction one by one. And she had felt something she later described to her niece as the particular loneliness of being right about something that is hurting people you know. She watched with quiet sadness. She did not feel vindicated. She felt the way you feel when a storm you predicted arrives anyway and does the damage you said it would. By the spring of 1987, Nora Reinhardt had $71. Zero in savings, a paid-for farm, and a growing conviction that something was wrong with the numbers coming out of the Grundy County elevator. Not wrong in a dramatic way. Not fraud, not necessarily. Just wrong in the quiet, persistent, systematic way that Walter had taught her to notice. Her own difference column had been running between 4% and 6% for 3 years, 4% below what her field estimate said she'd harvested, below what her yield monitor reported, below what the arithmetic of her planted acres and her average yield should have produced. She had asked the elevator manager about it twice. He had explained shrinkage and moisture dockage and handling loss and the tolerance built into the scale certification. He was polite. He was thorough. He did not change the numbers. Then Harold Fenwick died, and his box of papers went to auction, and Nora drove to Grundy Center and paid $40 for 16 years of someone else's difference column. Now, when Nora Reinhardt spread Harold Fenwick's papers across her kitchen table in the spring of 1987, she was not looking for anything specific. She was looking the way Walter had taught her to look, which was systematically, without a conclusion already formed, letting the numbers tell her what they wanted to say. She started with the scale tickets. Harold had kept everyone. 16 years of them, rubber-banded by crop year and labeled in the same deliberate hand she recognized from the notebook. She matched them against his elevator receipts. Then she matched both against the yield estimates in his notebook, which Harold had calculated field by field using a method she recognized immediately because it was nearly identical to Walter's. The gap was there. It had been there since 1974. It ran between 4 and 8% every year, sometimes higher in wet years, sometimes lower in dry ones, but never zero, never in Harold's favor, always the same direction. Harold had noticed it in 1975 and had started keeping the notebook that year. He had tried to explain it through moisture. He had tried to explain it through his yield monitor, calibration. He had tried to explain it through the weight of the grain cart he used to haul from the field to the bin. He had ruled out each explanation methodically, the way a man who had been farming for 30 years ruled things out, carefully and without drama. By 1983, he had written in the notebook in a passage that Nora read 3 times that he could not find the source of the discrepancy in his own operation, and that he had begun to wonder whether the source was somewhere between his farm and the elevator's final tally. Nora set the notebook down. She went to her own records. She pulled the manila envelope for 1984, the year Walter died, and the envelopes for 1985 and 1986. She laid her scale tickets next to Harold's. The gap in her records was smaller than Harold's, but it was there, and it was consistent, and it ran in the same direction, and that's why nobody understood the purchase. They were seeing a grieving eccentric buying a dead man's junk. They were watching a farmer begin a 3-year investigation into systematic grain measurement error that would eventually cost the Grundy County elevator its certification and return $340,000 to the farmers of that county. Let me tell you about the investigation, because this is where Nora proved that Walter Reinhardt's ledger was not a hobby. It was a weapon. She started in the fall of 1987, her own harvest. She did something she had never done before. She hired a certified scale inspector from Des Moines, a man named Harold Poole, who charged $200 for a day's work, and she had him ride with her to the elevator on 3 separate loads across 3 separate days. Harold Poole was not there to watch the weighing. He was there to watch the process, the whole process, from the time the loaded wagon crossed the inbound scale to the time the tare weight was recorded and the net bushels were calculated. He had a clipboard and a calibrated reference scale in the back of his truck. He was a small, quiet man who wore the same expression whether he was looking at a balance sheet or a grain bin, which was the expression of someone who had stopped being surprised by what he found. On the first load, Harold Poole found nothing he could point to specifically. The scale read within certification tolerance. The moisture meter read within certification tolerance. The dockage calculation was applied correctly. The net bushels on the ticket matched the arithmetic. He made notes. He said nothing to the elevator staff. On the second load, Harold Poole asked to see the scale's calibration certificate. The elevator manager produced it. The certificate was current. Harold Poole looked at it for a long time and then asked when the scale had last been calibrated under load, meaning with a test weight actually placed on the platform rather than with the adjustment made electronically. The manager said the electronic calibration was the certified method. Harold Poole agreed that it was a certified method. He wrote something in his notebook and said nothing else. On the third load, Harold Poole brought his reference scale. He weighed a 50 lb certified test weight on the elevator's inbound scale. The elevator's scale read 49 pounds and 2 oz, 14 oz light per 50 pounds. On a load of 10,000 pounds of corn, that was 175 pounds. At 1 tay, 80 a bushel and 56 pounds to the bushel, that was 5 per load. Nora delivered approximately 200 loads to that elevator in a good corn year. She did the arithmetic on the drive home. It came to $1,126 per year. Over the 3 years she had been tracking the A in her own records, it came to $3,378. Over the 16 years Harold Fenwick had been keeping his notebook applied to his larger operation, it came to something considerably more. She did not call the elevator. She did not call the co-op board. She called Harold Poole and asked him what the correct procedure was. Harold Poole told her that the Iowa Department of Agriculture's Weights and Measures Division handled scale certification complaints, and that a written complaint with documented evidence would trigger a formal inspection. He told her this in the same quiet voice he used for everything. He told her she had documented evidence. She spent the winter of 1987 and 1988 building the complaint file. She used Harold Fenwick's 16 years of records and her own 7 years of records. She calculated the gap for each crop year for each farm using Harold's field estimates and her own cross-referenced against the scale tickets and elevator receipts. She typed the complaint on a typewriter she had bought used in 1979, 42 pages with appendices. She mailed it to the Iowa Department of Agriculture in February of 1988 with a certified return receipt. Harold Poole's inspection report was attached as Exhibit A. The Iowa Department of Agriculture sent an inspector to the Grundy County elevator in April of 1988. The inspector found that the inbound scale had been operating with a calibration error of between 0.8 and 1.4% for an indeterminate period, that the error was consistent with the pattern documented in Nora's complaint, and that the electronic calibration records showed the error had been introduced during a software update to the scales control system in 1973. Harold Fenwick had noticed it in 1975 and had spent the last decade of his life trying to prove something that a software log entry confirmed in an afternoon. The elevator's certification was suspended pending correction and recalibration. The co-op board convened an emergency meeting. The board retained an accounting firm from Waterloo to calculate the aggregate underpayment to all farmers who had delivered to that elevator between 1973 and 1988. The accounting firm worked for 4 months. The total came to $2 million across all affected farmers. The co-op's insurance carrier negotiated the settlement. The farmers of Grundy County received $340,000 in aggregate restitution. The portion the insurance carrier agreed to cover, distributed pro rata based on documented delivery records. Farmers with complete records received more. Farmers who had thrown away their scale tickets received less. Nora Reinhardt received $18,400. Harold Fenwick's estate, administered by his daughter in Ames, received $31,200, calculated from the 16 years of records Nora had bought for $40 and submitted as documentation. If you have ever watched a community dismiss something as worthless that turned out to be the only record of the truth, stick with me. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story I'm telling, because there are more of them, and they are all about the same thing. Let me tell you about what happened over the next 8 years, because this is where the story stops being about a scale calibration error and starts being about what a woman does when she has proven to an entire county that she was right and they were wrong. And the answer is that she goes back to work. Nora did not hold a press conference. She did not write a letter to the Grundy Register. She did not accept the invitation from the Iowa Farmers Union to speak at their annual meeting in 1989, though she received the invitation and kept it in a file folder. She cashed the restitution check, deposited it in the savings account that now held $84,000, and planted her corn in May of 1988 the same way she had planted it every May since 1984. She bought a new grain moisture meter that fall, a Dickie John model, and she calibrated it against a certified reference sample she obtained from the Iowa State Extension Office in Ames. She updated the calibration record in the ledger. She continued. The 1988 drought came that summer and took a third of the corn crop across much of Iowa. Nora lost yield like everyone else. She did not lose her farm. Her operating costs were low enough and her savings deep enough that a bad year was a bad year and not a catastrophe. She watched 3 farms in the county go to auction that fall. Farms that had against land values that the drought had not improved. She watched with the same quiet sadness she had felt in the early years of the decade. She sent food to one of the families. She did not say anything about the auction. By 1991, Nora Reinhardt had $97,000 in savings and 320 acres of paid-for ground. She had also quietly and without announcement began attending every farm auction in Grundy County and the 3 counties adjacent, not to buy equipment, to watch the land. She kept a separate notebook, smaller than the ledger, in which she recorded the per-acre sale price of every parcel that went to auction within driving distance, the soil productivity rating from the county assessor's records, the buyer's name when she could learn it, and the terms of sale when they were disclosed. She had been keeping this notebook since 1989. By 1991, it contained records of 34 separate land sales. She was not ready to buy yet. She was watching the market the way Walter had watched the elevator, systematically, without a conclusion already formed, letting the numbers tell her what they wanted to say. In the spring of 1993, 160 acres came to auction in the northeast corner of Grundy County, 2 miles from Nora's home farm. The ground had belonged to a man named Clifford Moss, who had farmed it for 20 years and had borrowed against it in 1979 at land values that the 1980s had not sustained. Clifford had held on longer than most, refinancing twice, restructuring once, and finally running out of room in the winter of 1992. The auction was scheduled for March. The ground was rated at 87 on the Corn Suitability Rating Index, which was good ground, not exceptional, but honest ground that would yield consistently if it was farmed correctly. Nora's notebook showed that comparable ground in the county had sold for between $100 and $1,400 per acre in the past 2 years. At 160 acres the parcel should go for somewhere between $176,000 and $224,000. She had $112,000 in savings. She needed more. She went to her bank in Grundy Center and spoke with the loan officer, a man named Ron Stevens, who had been at that bank for 15 years and who knew Nora Reinhardt's financial history as well as he knew anyone's in the county. She told him she wanted to bid on the moss ground and that she needed a commitment for $120,000 to supplement her cash. Ron Stevens looked at her balance sheet for approximately 90 seconds. He told her the commitment was available. She thanked him, went home, and called Ron back the next morning to tell him she had decided not to use the loan. Ron asked her how she planned to buy 160 acres with $112,000. She told him she planned to buy what $112,000 would buy, and not a single acre more. The auction was on a Thursday in March, a cold, bright day with the ground still frozen, and the sky the particular pale blue that Iowa gets in early spring when the light is back, but the warmth hasn't followed it yet. There were 11 bidders registered. Nora recognized 8 of them. 3 were farmers from the county. 2 were investors from Des Moines. 1 was a land company representative from Cedar Rapids. 1 was a neighbor of Clifford Moss's who had been trying to buy the ground privately for 2 years and had not been able to meet Clifford's price. 1 was a man Nora did not recognize who had driven up in a truck with a Minnesota plate. The bidding opened at $900 per acre and moved in $50 increments. By $100 per acre, 4 bidders had dropped out. By $1,200, 6 had dropped out. At $1,250 per acre, the field was down to Nora, the land company representative from Cedar Rapids, and the man from Minnesota. At $1,300 per acre, the man from Minnesota dropped out. At $1,350 per acre, the land company representative raised his paddle. Nora raised hers. The land company representative raised his again. Nora looked at the auctioneer and said $400. The land company representative looked at his phone. He looked at the auctioneer. He shook his head. 160 acres at $400 per acre. $224,000. She had $112,000 in cash and a commitment for $120,000 from Ron Stevens. She used $112,000 of her own money and $112 of the bank's money and paid the balance in equal installments over 4 years at 7%, the lowest rate Ron Stevens could offer, and the only loan Nora Reinhardt had ever taken in her adult life. She paid it off in 3 years. The crowd at the auction was not large, maybe 40 people, but the people who were there had been farming Grundy County for a long time, and they knew Nora Reinhardt's name, and they knew about the elevator complaint, and some of them had received restitution checks that would not have existed without her $40 box of papers. When the auctioneer said, "Sold," and Nora put her paddle down, the crowd went quiet in a way that was not the ordinary quiet of an auction ending. It was the quiet of people rearranging something they had thought was settled. Not applause, not congratulation. The sound of a county recalibrating. Dale Reinhardt, her brother-in-law, was standing near the back of the crowd. He had come to watch the auction with no intention of bidding. He had heard Nora was registered and had come, he would tell people later, out of curiosity. When the hammer came down, he took off his cap and rubbed the back of his neck. He did not say anything to Nora that day. He called her 2 weeks later and asked if she needed any help getting the ground ready for spring planting. She thanked him and said she'd call if she needed anything. She did not call. Let me tell you how this ends, because the ending is the part that Walter Reinhardt would have understood without a word of explanation. Nora farmed 480 acres through the 1990s and into the first decade of the next century. The home place and the moss ground, and a third parcel of 80 acres she bought in 1998 from an estate sale in neighboring Butler County for $890 per acre cash from savings. She updated the ledger every Friday evening, sitting at the same kitchen table, under the same lamp with a cup of coffee and a mechanical pencil. She switched from a mechanical pencil to a ballpoint sometime around 1995, which is the only evidence in the ledger that time had passed. The manila envelopes continued. The difference column continued running at less than 1% after the elevator's recalibration, which she confirmed by repeating Gerald Poole's test weight check every 3 years using a 50 lb certified weight she kept on a shelf in Walter's workshop. In 2001, Nora's niece, Carol Reinhardt, the daughter of her brother, Gary, came to spend a summer on the farm at the age of 16. Carol had grown up in Ames and had no particular interest in farming when she arrived. She left in August with the ability to keep a double-entry ledger, calibrate a grain moisture meter, and read a scale ticket well enough to know when the arithmetic was wrong. She came back the following summer. She came back the summer after that. By the time she finished her degree in agricultural economics at Iowa State in 2008, she had been keeping the ledger alongside Nora for 7 years. She took over the operation in 2011 when Nora was 55 and ready to step back from the daily work, but not from the Friday evening ledger, which she continued to review every week, until her eyesight made it difficult. Walter's workshop is still standing. The oak workbench is still against the south wall. The lathe that came from Marshalltown in 1961 still runs. Carol's daughter, who is 13 now and already curious about the drill press, has been told she can use it when she's 14, which is the same age Nora was when she first used it. Which is the same age Nora was when she first understood that a number you couldn't verify was an opinion. In the fall of 2009, the Iowa Farmers Union invited Nora to speak at their annual meeting in Des Moines, the same invitation she had declined in 1989. She accepted this time. She spoke for 12 minutes. She did not use notes. She said that the yield monitor in a modern combine was a remarkable instrument and that she trusted hers within its stated tolerance, which the manufacturer listed as plus or minus 3%, and that she verified it against the scale ticket every year, and that the scale ticket was only as good as the scale, and that the scale was only as good as the last time someone had put a certified test weight on the platform and written down what it read. She said that the difference between what a farm reported and what a farm actually produced was not a rounding error. It was a number, and numbers had sources, and sources could be found if you were willing to keep the records and do the work. She said that Harold Fenwick had been willing, and that she hoped people in the room would remember his name because he had spent the last decade of his life trying to prove something that turned out to be true, and he had not lived to see it proven. And that was the kind of thing that happened when communities decided that a farmer's careful observations were the symptoms of confusion rather than the products of rigor. She said one more thing. She said that the $40 she had paid for Harold Fenwick's box of papers was the best investment she had ever made, and that she meant that not in the financial sense, though the financial sense was also true, but in the sense that Harold's records had confirmed for her that the gap between what you are told and what is actually true is almost always findable, and that finding it is simply a matter of deciding that the finding matters. Gerald Poole was in the audience. He was retired by then, 71 years old, sitting in the third row with his clipboard on his lap out of habit. He nodded once when she finished. She saw it. She nodded back. Let me ask you something. What do you see when you look at a box of old scale tickets? Most people see paper. Most people see the administrative residue of transactions that are finished, numbers that have already been settled, records that belong in a burn barrel or a recycling bin. Harold Fenwick saw something he couldn't quite explain. Nora Reinhardt saw a 16-year record of a systematic error that an entire county had decided to stop questioning. She saw the difference between what the yield monitor said and what the scale ticket said, and she understood that the difference was not the monitor's fault, and not the farmer's fault, and not the weather's fault. It was a number. It had a source. The source was findable. $40, a cardboard box, a dead man's careful attention to the gap between what he was told and what was true. The records nobody wanted in the hands of the woman nobody understood until the Iowa Department of Agriculture sent an inspector to Grundy County, and the scale read 49 pounds and 2 ounces where it should have read 50. And the silence that followed was the sound of 16 years of careful observation being confirmed at last.